Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Offset Podcast. And today we're taking a look at whether HDR has really taken off or maybe not. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by Flanders Scientific, leaders in color-accurate display solutions for professional video. Whether you're a colorist, an editor, a DIT, or a broadcast engineer, Flanders Scientific has a professional display solution to meet your needs. Learn more at flandersscientific.com.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of the Offset Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Robbie Carmen. With me, as always, is Joey Deanna. Hey, Joey, how are you doing, buddy?
Hey, everyone.
Joey, so today I want to talk about something that I think maybe is slightly controversial. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not, but maybe it's just me that thinks it's like, ooh, we got to be careful here. And that's the idea of whether HDR has really taken off. What do you think? Probably over a decade now, we've been talking about HDR in some flavor. I mean, we've done a lot of training about it. We've done a lot of evangelizing about it. We've talked about everything from HDR, 10 and 10 plus and Dolby Vision and all these workflows, and recently this kind of came to a little bit of, the forethought in our thinking, just because I'm sure everybody who's watching the episode is aware of Steve Yedlin's, seminar on HDR. And that was kind of, received in different levels of acceptance and pushback and all sorts of stuff throughout the web. But I wanted to take a little bit of a slightly different spin on it for this episode, because it's something that we've been talking a lot about over the past decade. But the question I have for today: has it really taken off? Right? It's something that you always hear about, but where kind of is the current state of it? And I think that's a little debatable, depending on who you ask, what the view on it is, what level you are in terms of production and post-production and the type of content you're doing. And it's a little more nuanced than just, yes, it's taken off, or no, it's not taken off. So I want to explore that thought, those thoughts today. And I guess we'll start out with, kind of the first part of this is it does seem to be everywhere. Would you agree with that assessment that HDR, no matter where you look on streaming platforms, on the web, etc., it's there, and it seems to be everywhere? But I'm not sure that's the best metric of has it taken off, just because it's in a lot of places,
Yeah, because if you look at kind of the penetration of HDR in the market in terms of hardware,
yeah,
it's everywhere. Almost
right.
Every device being sold right now that has a screen can show an HDR image and can decode an HDR signal and is basically ready for any flavor of HDR. I believe the stat is now either 8 or 9 out of 10 consumer televisions being sold support not just HDR, but Dolby Vision. And Android supports it, so every Android mobile device, all the Apple mobile ecosystem supports it, so basically every smartphone and tablet that's available for sale.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing it on computer displays, on desktop computers, laptop computers. Basically anything that you buy with a screen is gonna support HDR, which is like compared to the last big transition we had, which was SD to HD, I think that happened a lot slower in terms of displays, right?
Yeah.
We are getting HDR available everywhere. And now we're seeing it on services available everywhere as well. All of the TV streaming platforms support it. And every day we're getting more and more online streaming platforms, social media platforms supporting HDR. So it does, from an availability standpoint, it's absolutely everywhere. So why does it now kind of feel like, why isn't everything HDR? Why isn't everything that we're doing and producing HDR?
Exactly.
It doesn't feel right.
It doesn't feel right. And I think I think that's all spot on. I think clearly the hardware at the consumer level, the hardware at the, the professional level, the mastering level is there. It seems like, if you're going to invest in a new reference monitor these days, you're probably going to invest in one that can do, varying levels of HDR performance there. But I agree, it does feel like it's starting off. And, with the OTT platforms, It's kind of a weird thing because I think you're right. Yes, they all offer, whether it's just straight HDR10 or whether it's Dolby Vision or whatever. I mean, you can't go on Netflix and not see HDR content. Same for these other platforms. But there's a slight little caveat or asterisk by that if you have the right plan, right? All of these OTT platforms, yeah, the availability is there, but they're differentiating a little bit, technically differentiating between, if you have the entry level plan, yeah, you're probably not going to get HDR, Dolby Atmos, etc. That's going to be reserved, same thing with UHD. That's going to be reserved for the higher tier plans that, you know, I have to question how many people in the consumer landscape don't put those two things together, right? They go, cool, I just went to, big box electronics store, got my HDR television. They get home and they hook up their basic level OTT plan and think that they're watching HDR, right? I mean, I would have to imagine there's a few people who fall into that
I
category who have the right hardware but haven't married it up to the right plan.
as much as I hate to admit it, I think there's probably more people like that than not like that. And I think that's
Yeah.
that's kind of one of the bigger problems because no matter how much us nerds are into it, if
Yeah.
it's not the default, most consumers won't know it's there. I had family members that up until very recently had a standard def cable box plugged composite into an HD TV with it being stretched horizontally, and they didn't know. Like to them, that's just what TV looked like, and nothing seemed wrong to them.
You know what's
So
funny
it's
about that? I had a similar experience with a family member, and I went over to their house and they had run over, I don't know how they did this, but they had run over the cable attaching their cable box to their TV with like the vacuum cleaner and split the cable. You know what it was? It was a S video cable, like with that
oh,
big
there you
barrel
go.
end. And I couldn't find an S video cable anywhere. Like anywhere. I was like, I don't have any more of those in the box of tricks. But no, I agree. I mean, and I think that there's, a sponsor of the show and good friend Brom Desmond, FSI, said to us once, until the base level plans kind of incorporate HDR, then maybe it really hasn't taken off. And I didn't really put too much, thought into that at the time when they said that. But now that I think about it, that is probably likely a big mismatch where people go, "Ooh, my new TV looks great," not even realizing that they're not leveraging the HDR content.
Yeah. Now, one thing where that is the case, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the biggest evangelist for HDR in terms
Yeah.
of showing it to the consumer
Yep.
is the iPhone, right?
Totally.
Because, and it's interesting, it's not even for video. The default iPhone configuration takes photos in
Yep.
HDR.
Yep.
And if you send them via iMessage to another iPhone, they display in HDR completely by default.
Yep.
Uh, you would not believe how many people just think their iPhone takes better pictures because now it's displaying it in HDR. And
Yep.
when you get a picture from somebody, somebody texts you a picture, it comes up in HDR, it looks beautiful, pops off the screen. People are not knowing that that's what HDR looks like and
Right.
not associating it with things like their TV and streaming content and things like that. There's a big disconnect there. And I think it's an opportunity for kind of evangelizing the consumer a bit.
Yeah, and I think Apple in particular has done a fantastic job in the Apple way of putting that stuff in front of people without, hitting them over the head with the technical aspects of it. And there are some, obvious differences with HDR playback and performance on a mobile device like that versus a consumer TV. We don't have to get into all the details about how the various levels of Dolby Vision and stuff work with that, but I do think they've done a good job. Let's take a slightly different spin at this now that we've acknowledged there might be a slight disconnect between people buying capable hardware and then the services that they're using. The other question that I have about this, and when I talk to colleagues, of ours and friends of ours and stuff like that about, what they're doing, it just kind of hits me really hard that HDR still seems to be for a lot of higher end content, and it really even though people are prepared, have prepared themselves, they've bought HDR monitors, they're doing a couple HDR projects a year here, one movie here, one movie there, whatever. Um, it just seems like the middle level production and consequently the post production services for those middle level productions and low end productions for sure just haven't really embraced this, right? It's just sort of like, oh, like, well, what do we need that for, right? And I was thinking about this before we started recording today, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Cost is a factor. It does take some extra time, does take some extra effort, does, at least on the post-production side, does require some investment in the gear and stuff to do it. But one of the things I thought of, and I want to get your take on this, is, early on, I think I was really excited about the language of HDR. And what I mean by that is that, okay, we are going to have something here that is clearly and demonstratively different than the SDR content that we're watching, right? And early on, it felt like people were doing that, really were cranking it to 11 and kind of making it its own thing. In the past couple years, I think you're really hard pressed to tell the difference between, in a lot of cases, between the SDR version of a show and the HDR version of the show, because it seems like everybody is super conservative, super gun shy about pushing it, right? So yeah, you might have a great, an HDR grade that's 175 to 250 nits of peak luminance at, with hot spots. And it's like, what's the point? Like, why are we doing? And I think that like, that pushback has been, well, it's so different. I hate it. It's ugly. It gets into some of the sentiment from the discussion about this. But I think it's like, it's disappointing to me that that's where we are with the language of HDR. And I think it's making it for that middle-sized company just a really tough argument to, like, why would we pay extra money to basically have the same look and feel that we do now? And it's kind of turned a little bit into the higher end productions just doing it because it's part of the deliverable to get their show on the OTT platform. But it doesn't really feel like they want to do it. It doesn't really feel like they put a lot of effort into it sometimes. I don't know. Am I wrong about that? Have we regressed about the language of HDR in the past couple of years?
I think so. I tend to think so. There are so many films and shows that are HDR and are graded in a way that basically I think a lot of people are using the same print emulation looks that they've always used because they're really pretty in their own way. And then they're kind of encapsulating them into HDR and then boosting the brightness a little bit. And that's about it. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to dictate a creative style to anyone. I think that that's completely within the realm of what filmmakers can and should decide their images should look like. And the question of should the HDR look different is
it's a big one.
It's a valid one because in theory, that shouldn't, right? In theory, you should have the best possible version of your film, the one you want people to see, how you want people to see it. And yes, if it goes down the line to a less good format, you can adapt it to that format. But in general, you want your master hero deliverable to be, this is the absolute best way I want it to be presented to the audience. We see that with top level films that, film in IMAX, and the filmmakers are like, you need to go see this in an IMAX film theater to get the whole experience, right? That's fine. There are still 35 millimeter prints going out to other theaters, and there's still, HD or 2K DCPs going out to theaters of those films. But the idea is that the filmmaker decided, okay, my vision of it is in this format, this visual, and then everything else is going to be derived from that. I think a lot of filmmakers and a lot of filmmakers right now are setting that default deliverable of where I want my absolute master image to be is kind of an old SDR.
But is that driven by just their taste and what they like and what they know, or is that driven by like, the idea that where the most eyeballs are, because I think arguably the most eyeballs are still going to be on an SDR image, no matter where it is, back seat, back headrest of a plane, somewhere else, that doesn't have that capability.
Yeah,
But
so it becomes a chicken and the egg problem.
yeah,
If a
yeah, exactly.
filmmaker does want to embrace kind of what you can get with HDR visually that you can't get on a SDR display, it's tough because it does mean sacrificing what a lot of those downstream viewers are going to see. But there's plenty of filmmakers that do that with things like
Yeah.
IMAX as well
Well,
already, and they're kind of considered the forefront, right? They're the top level. So it's tough. It's a tough
yeah,
question, and I do think there's a lot of momentum in there as well. It is the images they're used to looking at that they're comfortable with.
totally.
That, and you know what? That's an artistic decision, and I don't want to dictate to not do that. But it
No, I,
is a
I
little
agree.
bit of a chicken and the egg problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I think some of this in part has been like, how should I say this? I think if we had started out a couple years ago, a decade ago, with the idea that, okay, we are going to totally divorce the HDR component of this from the SDR component of it, we'd be having a slightly different discussion to these days. I think a lot of this malevolence towards HDR is derived because of the need, or not the need, but the requirement to package the SDR alongside with the HDR for deliverables to a lot of these OTT platforms without the benefit of doing a completely bespoke SDR version and a separate HDR version, right? And I think that has, and we've experienced this, right? You might want to crank the HDR grade to 1 million, but guess what? Doesn't really translate all that well when you have to go to lower performance HDR or the SDR. So therefore, we're just going to be a whole lot more conservative about it in general, so we can pretty much get the same thing between it. Now, like companies like Dolby have, I think, started to come around to address this discrepancy and this problem because they've heard from enough people. It'll be interesting to see how Dolby handles this, in particular Dolby, because that's where a lot of these, the multifaceted deliverables with SDR going. It'll be interesting to see how they handle it, in future iterations of Dolby Vision. But I think that's a large part of it. I think that people have gone, cool, this HDR in itself might be awesome and great to look at, but it's inconsequential to me because I can't get that look consistently downstream. You know what I'm saying? And I think they've just decided, well, you know what the path of least resistance is? Just make it HDR-ish, and then we have a much better fighting chance at the SDR being the way that we want it. And I
Yeah.
think
And the
I think it's
upside to that is, from a artistic perspective, at least now, even if you do, kind of box yourself into an SDR grade in an HDR container, at least now the playback is going to be a lot more consistent
that's
on
true.
devices everywhere, which I think is a
But
huge move forward.
but I do think it's going to take a development or a change in thinking, maybe if it change in technology where we just go, this SDR is one thing and this HDR is a different thing, right? And I think that would empower filmmakers a little bit to kind of think about them as, because right now it's a challenge to think about it as like, how do I create one cohesive thing that works across this broad range of performance capabilities? And that's can be challenging. It's certainly challenging, to do it when you're trying to really push things. And I think that maybe we'll be to that place eventually where it's just going to goes, nope, this is HDR only content, movie, show, whatever, and we're not even going to worry about the SCR. Are we there yet? Not even close. But I do think that eventually will, that could change the thinking about it. Let me ask you a slightly different question now. I think when I think about that middle size company, middle to small size company, what has been the primary limitation of them getting into HDR? I think it's a couple things. Number one, from a business point of view, it's just demand. Who's asking for this content? Probably not a lot of middle to lower end tier people are. But two, I think there's been some technical hurdles, namely the cost of capable HDR reference monitoring that stopped a lot of people from getting into this, right? I mean, even today here in 2025, I mean, you still have to spend to get a traditional reference monitor, you still have to spend, a lot of money, right? And that's changed a little bit in the past couple of years. FSI has come out with their QD line, which is a little more affordable. Companies like Asus have come out with, they're also offering a QD monitor now that I think is like $1,800, $1,900. I mean, so we are getting better at that. But then, there's a whole bunch of people that want to do this. So they go get a consumer TV that can do HDR, and then they don't, we've discussed this ad nauseum in other episodes. They're running into technical problems they don't even realize they're having because of the capabilities of the set. So, I mean, I think that we are also not quite there yet on the acceptance factor or the infiltration, if you will, of capable reference monitoring over a broad swath of, types of companies too.
Yeah, it becomes an issue of where's the demarcation line of this amount of investment is good enough to really do professional work that
Right.
I want to stand behind with my client versus I'm
Right.
kind of experimenting to see the future, but I'm going to go back to what I know as a post-production vendor, which is SDR.
Yep. Yep. I think that's true. And I think, there's been other hurdles too. I mean, at least initially, if you wanted to get into a Dolby Vision workflow, years ago, it was super expensive. Then they dropped the price. And there's still, I mean, the cool thing is, obviously you can do basic Dolby Vision packaging in a tool like DaVinci Resolve. There is still a license to get trims, but now the good news is that it's a perpetual license, not a yearly thing. So you can kind of buy it once and be done with it. And it'd be interesting to see where they go with that in the future as well. But I mean, those kind of HDR reference monitoring, I think, has been a big hurdle, but it still doesn't fix the issue of demand, right? You're not going to get a lot of people to spend a ton of money on reference monitoring if nobody's asking for it. And so I think, one of the problems or issues with, as far as I'm concerned, with uptake of HDR for that middle to lower end crowd is just how to sell it, right? How to convince people that it's there. And we know you and I offline have this talk frequently about how to get more HDR work and whatever. And I think from our perspective, one of the things that we've been trying to do with varying levels of success is just put it on every single project order or every bid, right? And just say, hey, this is an optional thing that we think you could do. And for a television network, it might be, well, yeah, okay, well, this show is just not going to be HDR, so just give us the SDR. But for that independent filmmaker, doing an independent narrative, doing an independent doc or whatever, I do think that there is logic in, hey, if you haven't already been commissioned by one of these OTT platforms, this gives you a leg up. You have a complete set of deliverables that you can now go, oh, hey, Netflix or hey, Amazon or whatever, we have this HDR version of the film too. And I do think there is some logic that makes those films and those projects more marketable. But it's still, again, it's an additional cost that people look at and go, do I really need to spend this money when nobody's really asking me for this yet? And I don't know. That's a tough nut.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard question is, as a post-production vendor, do you try to move that ball forward by just including it at either no cost or low cost so you can kind of get the clients into there? Or do you do you integrate it into the bid for everything and just kind of raise prices to compensate? There's a couple different ways that you can kind of attack that, and I don't think there's a perfect answer for that.
And part of the challenge here too is that, like, okay, fine, you can put, hey, here's some Dolby Vision grading and packaging or whatever, and put it on your bid, and people just go, what's that? What do you mean?
Yeah.
What does that do for my film? And so then you open up this can of worms where it's like, you have to demonstrate and show them what it means. You have to have this. It's not just the cost that's on the PO or the bid. It becomes this whole other thing where, for the uninitiated, you're having to show them and try it and have those kind of aesthetic and creative, discussions with them. This is what we could do. How do you feel about that? And so it's like, it ends up being, for the post-production vendor, it actually ends up being just a crap ton of extra work besides just the doing it part, the sales, the communication, all of that kind of. So it's like, you think it's bad when people are like, well, what screen should I look at? Have that
Yeah.
conversation about your HDR, and what are they actually seeing on this device versus that device. It can get to be a very technical conversation where very quickly you can get clients to gloss over and just go, yeah, that's not really my thing. Like, so like, I think it's
The
still.
other side of that coin, though, is if you do kind of start out in an HDR world and you say, hey, take your iPad Pro, flip it into reference mode, view this on that, you can use this as a way to bypass but on my grandma's computer at their beach house, it looks
Right,
kind of purple,
right.
notes from the client.
Yeah, I think a lot about our audio partners and how they do a lot of things, and it's like, we had a discussion with them a couple weeks ago, and it was like we start every project in Atmos. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, Atmos is the audio equivalent to Dolby Vision. Kind of the wide end of the funnel, and I'm like, really? You're doing everything in Atmos when nobody's even paying you for it? And it goes, yeah, it just makes all of the downstream deliverables much easier, right? So if somebody needs a 7.1 and a 5.1 and a stereo, we can just do it all from that one wide end of the funnel. And I just have not yet to date really found that to be true with a Dolby Vision workflow in particular, just because it's just sort of like there's so much opinion on the matter, right? And there's so much kind of forced feedback about what you're seeing looks so much different than what you have traditionally seen, that people just don't want to even get into that ecosystem because they're scared of it still. But I do
I
see
will
that.
say this.
Yeah.
I have on more than one project done the full Dolby Vision workflow, graded it in HDR, did the SDR trim just as a way to make my SDR.
Yep.
I started doing it as just an experiment. I was like, okay, well, this project's not going to be HDR, but it is really pretty. Why don't I grade it in HDR, then take a little bit of extra time, make a really good SDR trim pass, and just send that to the client as
Good
my
for you.
grade, and then get notes on it, and then go through the rest of the process and deliver it that way. And
Yeah.
for a couple things, it actually worked really well. It was a little bit of an extra time involved, so it's not something I would recommend on a major critical project, but it meant at the end of the day, I had a Dolby Vision Master for that project ready to go if I ever need it, and the client had already approved the
Well,
SDR trim.
yeah, and I mean, and honestly, that's the way. I mean, I think that's the way I would like to be working. I think the reality of it is that um, it's kind of more times than not, it's the other way around. It's
Yeah.
okay, we got an SCR version, now let's kind of go up to HDR. With that said, I think there's another thing that's at play here with just the industry and kind of the attitudes in general, and that is, I think a lot of people, and I've talked to people that have this feeling that they are feeling dictated to, told what to
Mm.
do when it comes to their creative process, right? Now, if you look at it from like a 50,000 point of view, we've always been told what to do. There's always specs and deliverables and QC and all that kind of stuff. But I think there is this gut reaction to, I am not going to be told how bright to make something, how to like, and like, there's all
Yeah.
these myths I think that are so like, I had somebody the other day tell me, well, Dolby mandates that you have everything at 1,000 nits. What? Nobody mandates that, right? But I think that those kind of things they've snowballed, right? People are being like, I'm gonna have this. I hate this because some big massive corporation is telling me how to make my film, and
Yeah.
whether that's true or not, I think is somewhat debatable. But I don't think that, in my personal opinion, nobody's saying that. But I think yes, you can have those debates. But I think that has polarized our industry a little bit about this. And Steve's recent seminar, I thought, there were some things I agreed with in that seminar. There were some things that I disagreed with in that seminar. But what I walked away from the most after watching it was, man, he is identifying a polarization point in the industry about this that's probably not going to get better anytime soon, because there are people
Yes.
who have already convinced themselves this is horrible. I hate it. Stop telling me what to do. And then there are people who are like, nope, this is cool. I want to try things. And I don't think, just like we have in other aspects of our society, I don't think one side is going to convince the other side or vice versa. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I would just say I don't want to dive deep into Steve's presentation because I think everybody that's watching this should take it's
Absolutely.
long. It's about 2 hours, and it is massively worth not just watching, but watching in detail and considering in detail because I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but the way he gets to the conclusions, even the conclusions that I don't agree with, are so logically laid out that just from a learning perspective and understanding the science of imaging, it is worth that presentation is worth its weight in absolute gold just to watch and understand his reasoning and follow his train of thought because it's so well thought out.
I mean, clearly, I mean, he's a master explainer, and but I do think.
But we're seeing that kind of duality here, even right now in this podcast. Because earlier I'm like, yeah, why don't people want to go past SDR, luminance, and saturation? And then the next sentence I said was, yeah, but I don't want to tell the artists how to do it. So I should be saying do whatever you want, but I'm also saying at the same time I want to see this kind of style and more more HDR-ish images out in the world. So I'm kind of conflicting with myself right now.
It's complicated simply because I mean, I do agree with the side of the arguments about the emotional and like kind of intrinsic feel differences. Like that's, you can't get around that, right? Like when you're, for 100 and something years, used to content that is what we're used to, everything is going to feel differently. But what I'm pushing back on is just that, like, that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it different. I remember when I lived in Australia, right? And like, first time I ever, when I landed in the country and like got in a cab, and the driver's on the other side of the car and we're driving on the other side of the road, right? And I remember going, oh, we're driving on the wrong side of the road. And the cab driver just looked back and just said, no, it's just the other side of the road or the different side of the road, And it's just like, it feels to me that's kind of like an analogous thing to some of this HDR argument. It's like, yeah, I can totally get with how people think this is the wrong side of the road. But in reality, it's just different. And any difference, any challenge to established workflow, doctrine, whatever it may be, always has pushback, always has a feeling of wrongness to it. Always, you know what? I just think that we're not developed enough. We're still so early on in the infancy of this, where it just really hasn't developed. And I mean, I don't know. Tell me how you feel about this. I don't think that the technology has also fully developed yet on a lot of levels, right? I mean, and that's even a baseline. Like, you're a big evangelist for the advantages of PQ as an absolute kind of, hey, every absolute relationship between light output and that kind of stuff. I mean, who's to say that PQ can't adapt and change over the next decade or two to, fix some of the technical problems? We've seen that with, color management systems like ACES, which continues to adapt. Like, there's nothing to say that, PQ, HLG, and that kind of stuff can't continue to adapt to address some of the potential limitations of it right now.
Yeah, and we've seen that already, and I think we definitely need more of it. One of the big problems with PQ is it can't map up, which for some viewing environments just doesn't work. Dolby started to address that with like their Dolby Vision IQ, where it has like a light sensor on the display and it kind of adapts to the viewing environment a little bit better. We're also seeing that, kind of back to the beginning of this discussion, the mobile devices have kind of led the charge on that, because if you look at HDR content on your phone, you can crank the brightness up, you can crank the brightness down. You're managing your own display brightness on a mobile device drastically more often than you are on a television or in a reference environment. And I don't think the standards were initially designed with that in mind. So as this evolves, the ability to handle different viewing environments, I think, is going to improve, I hope. But also, we can kind of like, do we need to go up? Do we need to be able to encode up to 10,000 nits? Maybe looking back, that's not necessary. And it would be a more efficient use of data to be able to scale the PQ curve, for example, to make better use of code value precision, things like that. You know, you're right. These things are, yes, they're standardized, and standards do evolve. And I would like to, I think to get us to this point where like everything is HDR and we're in happy, wonderful, imaginary land, like we kind of said we aren't yet. I think the standards do need to evolve a little bit. The technology does need to evolve a little bit with kind of what we've learned over the past decade of implementing this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, so to kind of sum that up, I don't think the pushback from the non-HDR crowd is invalid at all. I think there's a lot of validity to the things that they say, but I also think that the things that the HDR proponents are trying to do are also perfectly valid. And it just feels that we have, again, just like a lot of things in our society, we've made this into a polarizing thing when I just don't think it really needs to be. I think that like we can do both. We can push the technical and performance, abilities of what we're doing now with an eye towards legacy and aesthetic and all of that kind of stuff. I don't think it really has to be an if or then conversation. And again, I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that early on and still to today, it is challenging to do everything in one all-inclusive packaging, right? If Netflix said tomorrow, hey guys, every production can deliver a bespoke SDR and an HDR package, and we're not going to derive the SDR out of that HDR package at all, it would make a lot of people really happy, right? Because then they wouldn't have to be like, oh, now we have to, dumb down our HDR to make the SDR look good. So I think that part of it, with all of the work that people are doing on the technical side and the creative side is getting there. But last thing I want to say about on this topic for, small companies like us is I would just say, don't give up on it either. I just think that, people, a decade ago who were like, man, I'm not getting into 3D. I think like they were probably right about that, right? Like that, even though it's making a little bit of a comeback with headsets and all that kind of stuff, I still think it's proven itself to be a little bit of a niche thing. I just don't think with HDR we are the snowball effect over the past decade is so massive with so many billions, right, involved that nobody's walking away from this yet, And so I think that like you gotta be in it on some level, knowledgeable about it or whatever. And this stuff about the language of it and the creative, aspect, I think that will get worked out. And also, I just want to say one more thing about the creative side because it just dawned on me, and I know that you'll love this reference because he's one of your favorite colorists, right? Go do yourself a favor and watch some stylized HDR shows from Ian at Light Iron, Ian Vortevec at Light Iron, right? Yes. What was the show that he did I know Tales from the Loop was one of my favorite on Amazon that he did. What was the one that you really liked?
Glow.
Oh yeah, Glow. That's what it was. And so like
I still think that is the benchmark for a incredible looking HDR grade that
had throwback to the SDR.
It had a throwback look, but it just worked in its own way. It wasn't it was a visual. I need to go back and rewatch it again with this conversation in mind. But I think
I think a lot of his work and that kind of work in that vein to incorporate a lot of the aesthetic choices that were made in the film and SDR world and try to update those a little bit into the HDR world. I felt the same way about the Amazon series he did, Tales from the Loop. I was just like, this is gorgeous, like absolutely gorgeous. And I felt the same way about our buddy Dan Moran and his grade on Adolescence, which is like the biggest show and biggest thing in the world right now on Netflix. Again, and Dan has probably one of the sharpest, most creative filmic eyes that I know. It's incredible to see when people put in the effort. And I think that's part of it. I think it's like giving the artists space and time to sort of figure this out a little bit. And I think that's part of the dictating thing too. It's like, oh yeah, you've done all this work. Now you need to do an HDR version, and everybody scrambles and just goes, whatever.
Yeah.
But when you allow them the space to think about it and go, all right, how can we get our look and feel into this place? Really magical things happen. So I would encourage everybody to go check out some of that more modern stuff, Ian's work, Dan's work, because it's like, to me, it's like the best of both worlds. It really is giving a little bit of that, hat tip to the traditional aesthetic, but updating it for an HDR world. I mean, listen, man, I know that if we could, be in a situation where, we hit that mark, a lot of people's ideas about HDR would probably change, right? And I think, again, for me, it's just that those people and the teams involved in those projects and many projects like them were given the time, the effort, the headspace to think about how can we get this into an HDR looking thing that still works for everybody. And I think to the detractors' point, yeah, there's plenty of bad HDR. There's plenty of bad HDR, but
there's plenty of bad SDR.
Right. Don't let the bad HDR be, the definitive statement on the matter, because I think if you do a little digging, you will find some good HDR. And, this is we'll have to revisit this in a couple of years, because I think that, again, that's, it's still an ongoing developing set of things. And now that we have, a good solid decade under our belts, I, for one, am excited where the next decade goes on all levels. Monitors, mobile devices, the standard bodies with, things like PQ and HLG, like color spaces, all of that kind of stuff. I think we are on, okay, we've learned a lot. We know what works now. We know it doesn't work. And we've talked about some of these things in other episodes, right? Like when Bram was on with us talking about monitors and, was going on about Rec 2020. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, that does make sense that it was a little ass backwards to begin with, right? So, I think as an industry, we are learning. It just, it just might not be at the speed to impact somebody's project right this second, but I do think it's going to get better.
Agreed.
Cool. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thanks for checking out another episode of the show. Just as a reminder, you can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. The show is also available on YouTube, and on all those places, just search for the Offset Podcast. You can always head over to offsetpodcast.com to find episodes as well. And over there, too, we sometimes put additional show notes, links, transcript, that kind of stuff as well. Thanks, as always, to our sponsor, Flanders Scientific, and to you guys, our audience, who keep watching these shows and, making us want to do them. So we appreciate that as well. Until next time, I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Diana. Thanks for listening.